may well have come across return on expectation rather than ROI. You've heard of that? Yeah? Or well, certainly looking at accounting for the broader concept of value, return on value. And I think sometimes the best way to do it is give some practical examples of what I mean by this. And there is some handouts for those of you in the public service arena which have taken from a great white paper that you can get on the net around social return on investment. It's really good stuff to read if you're that interested in your bedtime reading. It's like this link. But the whole idea around social return on investment is it's not about necessarily quantifying the pound notes. For most of us, on what we've got over here at level 4, we want to put a monetary value against that. But this is about saying not every single outcome needs to be able to put a monetary ROI on it. It's also much more about assessing the impact of what we're doing on the economy or the environment. Now, one real area, NHS is a prime example. We talked about NHS a little bit earlier. And I've been doing quite a bit of work within Cambridgeshire County Council and taking all of their internal learning development team through a process of internal consulting and ROI. And one of the areas that they chose particularly to focus on social return on investment was in the area of child services. So just to think for a scenario for a moment, we've got a team of managers within the social care arena who are underperforming. They are not regularly, in fact they're very rarely conducting a performance review or appraisal. Probably sounds familiar, any of you are in these sorts of environments because of the pressure that they're under. What's happening as an outcome on that is that they've got care workers who feel disengaged with their management population. And the outcome from that is that when they get an opportunity to move on somewhere else, they are. So you've got a high turnover of care working staff, particularly skills. They're really value-based people. Their whole ethos about the way they work is about being treated fairly, about the relationships that they create, and actually the relationships they create internally as well. So if you've got somebody who's not giving them any time and attention, they're going to move on. What was the outcome on that, do you think? If you've got regular turnover of care workers,
quality of services to clients.
Yeah, and your clients are kids at the end of the day, they're children. And that child might have 3 or 4 different social workers or care workers for that period of that year as a result of that. So if you come back to root cause here again, you're thinking, well, what I want to do, what the council quite rightly wanted to do, is to do some performance management appraisal training for managers. Now, that may sound very straightforward and simple, but it is absolutely critical that they didn't just look at putting a series of training events in there, but they looked at the whole cycle of engagement to ensure that there was a social ROI on this. Ultimate KPI was there that a child would have, at least for a 12-month period, that same social worker in care for them to improve the outcome for that child. So when they were looking at delivering an ROI, it was extremely interesting. They started to look at all the data that was associated with why people move on, what they would need to help them design the way they delivered that training piece. And it also helped them to put in some stakes in the ground through the process of that project to ensure that there's some return on investment for them. First of all, it was about, can we start to see social workers were being retained for that bit longer in the business? How often were they having the appraisals? What was the quality of that appraisal time? What was the feedback from internal surveys and so on? So that's a very just simple example of SRoI, and we could probably be looking at that in a number of different areas where we're looking at care or environmental issues as well. How many of you in the room here? Sorry, Ian. Yeah.
So, I suppose it just raises the question for me. How do you know, or how do you demonstrate that what you've done has led to that improvement in care?
Yes.
So I might have done lots of things to improve appraisal or loan management or whatever it is. But then how do I demonstrate that that was what's actually made the difference?
Yes.
Or something completely
random. Or it could be based on new legislation, policy, anything that might have impacted. We'll look at this in a moment. We'll look at level 4 because the same principles apply. That if you're going to be looking at isolating the impact of what you're doing against other activities, you need to be aware of what other things are going on. And that may sound very simple. I like simple things that work. That's part of your consulting analysis, that you understand what's going on in the wider context of the political social arena that might actually impact on what you're doing anyway, and then you decide in conjunction with however you're working with your outcomes to proportion that ROI to certain elements. So an example might be that we have change of government is a pure example in this, where the policies will then change the way that we're going to operate with that child. And they could either make that more effective or less effective. So we need to be very aware and build this into our business case. Yeah. Anybody else working in this environment where this type of ROI is really key? Yes. Okay. Can you just talk a little bit about that for a minute and what you're doing?
Okay, so I work for a third sector network organisation.
Yeah.
We have members who are independent advice centres.
Yes.
So what they're doing is providing service to clients, people who need social welfare advice. So for us, it's about us demonstrating that the work that we do to upskill them is then going to be beneficial for those clients and is going to result in more funding for them, but also excellent services to those clients.
Yes.
It's not just about thinking about financial return on investment, it's thinking about measuring social as well.
Exactly. One of the things that does throw into relief though is, do I have a mechanism within my organisation already to measure what's happening now out there? And if I don't, then before I even start to look at any interventions whatsoever, I probably need to put that in if I'm not going to be struggling later to put the stakes in the ground. Again, simple stuff that works. We absolutely need to know where we are performing now if we're going to look at where we need to be performing. And often the data is the bit that's really challenging. How do we get hold of some of that data? How do we obtain it? Okay, so I'm going to move on just to share the level 4 model, and then before we finish for lunch, then we'll start to have a look at how do we go about presenting our business case. What measures do we have in place at the moment? How are we going to find some of this data, and what are we going to do with it? And the data that will tell us more about our costs, identify our costs, and tell us more about the benefits or the potential benefits. But the model itself is fairly straightforward. And yeah, in fact, just before I do that, there's a couple of bits there about principles of RoI, which might be just useful for a quick recap there. We need to involve all of our stakeholders when we're looking at social return investment. We just talked about that, in fact, that example we had there. We need to understand what changes and what needs to change. We need to value the things that matter. So it's not about just taking a random piece of data to analyse and only include what is material. What can we actually substantiate as being a change as well, which is the point that Ian was making. Do not overclaim. I'll talk about that a little bit later, about being really conservative about your expectations and meeting those rather than saying, do you know, I can make this impact. I would always take 25% of what I think I can do in terms of an impact to really measure and set my objectives around that. Talking about that. Be transparent and verify the results. So, I mean, there are a couple of just key pointers really in terms of what we might need to be doing. I'm just going to take us through this. I appreciate this is a little bit of a theory before we get back to the practical application of it again. But in essence, this is someone talks earlier about having a proper model to follow in terms of how we're going to do this. And to get level 4 outcomes, this is the model that I would be using within any organisation or our own organisation to do that. First thing we have to do is, having decided on our 3 KPIs, we will need to collect data to start with. And we said before that we could be doing this either post a piece of training, but ideally you want to be doing this before you even engage in a training intervention. Certainly you'd be wanting to do it again afterwards, the pre and post, but the whole idea is that you're looking to collect data. Now, it's got some interesting things here. We're talking about evaluation instruments, and that is about how. There might be all sorts of systems and processes within your organisations that you're working with, or in your clients' organisations that you can do this. So data from customers, data within HR department, attrition, absence figures. It could be data that's operational in terms of productivity and performance data and so on. But there may be a variety of different instruments, and you might want to consider what are those instruments for measurement that I've got. Or if I haven't got them, what are you likely to want to do?